Mangroves are the superstars under the nature-based solutions because not only do they do flood protection, because they act as natural barriers when sea levels are rising, but also next to rivers, they are also highly effective at capturing and at storing CO2, which helps to mitigate climate change. They support super rich ecosystems which sustain fish, like fisheries and cultural activities of local populations. And mangroves also, they filter pollutants from urban waters before they reach the oceans. Nature-based solutions have a lot of different types of impacts, so that's why they work also so well. It's having one key entry point for many different impacts.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Laia Bonet combines her passion for architecture with a deep commitment to helping cities adapt to climate change. After starting her career as an architect in Switzerland, she took a leap, moved to Cameroon and later to Nairobi to work for UN Habitat. There, her focus shifted from designing buildings to addressing the massive challenges of climate resilience in rapidly growing urban areas like Mozambique, Madagascar, Malawi, and Comoros. Her work includes restoring mangroves in Madagascar, a nature-based solution that protects communities from flooding while boosting local ecosystems. She's also faced cultural challenges like convincing locals in Cameroon that sustainable, locally produced bricks could look just as modern as concrete. Recently, devastating floods in Valencia have shown how even well-resourced cities are struggling with the impacts of climate change. Building on her experience in Africa, Laia talks about how participatory planning and sustainable strategies could help European cities better prepare for the challenges ahead. Laia's story is all about working with communities to create long-lasting solutions, and I can't wait for you to hear her stories and insights. So Laia, I'm super excited for having you here. We studied architecture together in Zurich, and you decided to move to Africa and focus on urban resilience. Tell me what led you to do that?
Thanks, Ladina. Hi, I'm very excited to be on your podcast. Thank you for inviting me. So yes, I started as an architect. I worked in Switzerland and then I left for Cameroon, where I worked as an independent architect as well for a while, for almost 2 years. And from there, I moved on then to working in urban resilience, more specifically at UN Habitat, United Nations Human Settlements Program, which is based in Nairobi in Kenya. So how did that happen to move from studying architecture in Switzerland to working in urban resilience in the regional office for Africa? I think that moment came while I was in Cameroon. I mean, I always had this question of what am I going to do with my studies? Because I am fascinated by architecture, but I'm also fascinated about the intersection architecture and urbanism. It's so diverse. And because it is the constructed form of our everyday lives, it holds all the beauty, the whole truth of our everyday lives, but also all the complexities. And one of the complexities that I really liked about, or let's say that really interested me and that is part of life, is the accelerating climate change. And I think that is something that we are all concerned with and that we know a lot about. The questions that we are always asking ourselves maybe were, how can we mitigate climate change? What can we do against climate change? Once I arrived in Cameroon, that question then started turning into not only what can we do to mitigate climate change, but also what can we do to adapt to it at the same time? Because that is when I realized that countries who suffer the most from climate change are often not the ones who are contributing to it. So there came the interest really to say, how can we do this the two at the same time?
And I remember when we were studying, you were already super interested always in more the urbanism projects than like the small detailed architecture projects.
Absolutely. I think, again, what was fascinating about the studies is we are not only looking at architecture and maybe at history of architecture and at how do I build a building, right? At the engineering part, but there is it's an intersection of social studies and political studies and geopolitical aspects of the whole thing. And I think that together with climate change is a part that I'm very interested in on my professional career.
Laia, in your role for the UN or in general, you're not a sustainability expert per se, but how does your work relate to sustainability specifically?
Absolutely. I think my work is pretty much aligned with sustainability because what I do could also go awfully wrong and can mean exactly the opposite if not done in a sustainable manner. So when we work on adapting to climate change and trying to mitigate climate change, so making cities more climate resilient, so who are able to overcome the impacts of climate change, it should always go with sustainability. Because I can give you a really silly example of how it could not. A really silly example would be having more air conditioning because it's hotter, but then the air conditioning is done without efficiency standards and is relying on fossil fuels. So that would be an example of how we could be adapting to climate change, but not at all trying to mitigate at the same time, right? So that would not be a sustainable way. Another example would be having the need to adapt to emerging flooding and therefore constructing dams and doing hard engineering. And this is a large-scale, concrete, massive construction that we would do, right? And that, for example, could be an adaptation measure, but on the other hand, it needs huge amounts of concrete. And it could also have long-term effects, like it could reduce the natural flood absorption of the ground or sometimes even destroy critical ecosystems. So there is poor planned climate adaptation, and that's why it's extremely important to do the work in urban resilience with always an idea of how can I do it in a sustainable manner. So that's why I would say there are sustainable ways of adapting to climate change, and that's what I have been doing for the past years, and that's why I would say I'm definitely working for sustainable development.
You just mentioned, I find that super interesting. You mentioned that resilience and sustainability sometimes come into conflict, like when the concrete flood barrier is necessary for protection, but it's not exactly sustainable. In such cases, how do you decide which priorities to emphasize?
That's a very good question. I think the first thing to do would be to always see what makes the most sense for the place that we are talking about, and to see what is the immediate need and urge that we have, and what are the potential solutions that we could be implementing. So looking at the situation right now, but also looking at what will it mean in future. And there it should, in my opinion, what works best is to have a set of people on the ground who have local knowledge. So people have been adapting to climate change for since humanity exists, people have been adapting. So local knowledge is there. And then combine that with scientific solutions. And usually we always find a solution that is the most sustainable for that particular context, that is context based. But sometimes, of course, I think that engineered solutions are also very interesting, are getting more and more innovative, are getting more and more environmentally friendly, and are, of course, sometimes needed for a certain place. Yes.
You also told me that often like communities have better insights, obviously, than like the policymakers, insights that they might even overlook. Is there kind of a project where local ideas inspired you or changed the way you approach resilience planning?
Yes, absolutely. So actually, most of the work that I've been doing at UN Habitat, but also outside of UN Habitat, has been in contact, in direct contact with the community. So I have been doing a lot of participatory approaches to plan for resilience, for actions, for measures to undertake. And participatory planning, as you say, is very important, because that's how you gather the local knowledge. That's how you make sure that people are involved from the beginning and will have full ownership of the project once it's going to be implemented. And that's also a way to not only you be able to plan with the communities and them being able to discuss around the major issues that are present, but also for them to be able to discuss with the authorities. So it's really also a platform to bring together municipalities and vulnerable communities on the one hand, but also sometimes municipalities and central government. So it's a really important tool if you want to make sure that the solution that is going to be implemented is efficient, that there is going to be sort of maintenance afterwards, because we've had cases. I mean, there have been cases. I know one from an island country I worked in, for example, where there were tons of trees being planted next to a river. And then a few days later, the trees were chopped off and used for cooking. Of course, because there was no awareness around it. The thing hadn't been planned with the communities, and the best way to ensure that the solution is effective and that it's going to be accepted and really it's coming from the people for the people, right? So the best way to do that is in participatory planning approaches.
So they forgot to educate the people there about the project.
Well, that's the problem with top-down solutions. They can work, but more often than not, they don't work. If I mean, of course, if I see something that I need, then maybe I'll grab it, right? So it's really important that it comes with awareness rising. Yeah.
And do you have some specific examples of bottom-up projects or ideas that were better than the top-down ideas that you brought in first, you with the other stakeholders?
Absolutely. So I supported a project that was, so I supported a big project on urban climate resilience in 4 different countries, in Mozambique, Madagascar, Malawi, and Comoros. And there, all kinds of measures were selected or prioritized by communities to reinforce the urban resilience of the cities they were living in. And that project actually resulted from participatory planning that was done beforehand. So there, really, municipalities and communities had decided together what their priorities are, what are the key entry points, and sort of an action plan, a strategy to say, okay, what do we need to do first to reinforce our resilience? And that is being implemented right now. It's finishing up this year. And it's really it's impressive because we have a wide range of solutions. I mean, there are not only physical solutions that can be built. There are quite a range of solutions and measures that exist, and partially people have been involved in the construction of the infrastructure. So, for example, in Comoros, in the capital city in Moroni, there has been a full drainage system that has been constructed on one specific place where there have been more and more floods over the past years. And part of the community members were recruited to work on it. And that was fantastic to see, because they really feel involved in the security of their neighborhood, of course, and they planned the project from the beginning, are able to help build it, and then afterwards also, of course, the maintenance of this drainage system will be way easier because people have ownership over the project. So there was that, but there were also many other examples across the 4 countries where there was reforestation, solid waste management, which is very important. If we build drainages, we need to keep them clean, because otherwise, if they're blocked and full of solid waste, this could worsen the flood risk and make the neighborhood even more vulnerable. So, I really like that project, because it was really taking all that local knowledge and the strategic planning into action, and also with a high participation of residents.
Yeah, I guess it's super important to really involve the local community so they take ownership and they feel responsible of the project and of taking care of their community.
Absolutely. And I think the energy and the ideas and the initiative is there. That's for sure. What is often lacking is resources. Communities, way more than here, I have to say, here right now where I'm in Switzerland, are commonly engaged in making their neighborhood better. The only thing is sometimes that it's difficult to access resources. And so what this participatory planning can do, and that's where UN Habitat, for example, would come in, or many other organizations, is that through the planning and the drafting of a strategy that is owned by the municipality and the communities, that's how they can also access climate financing, for example, to be able to implement some of the bigger engineering constructions, initiatives that they cannot do on their own.
So if there is no UN, and when there is a UN getting involved, how does that financial structure look like? Who brings in the resources? Is that the government, the communities, or are they dependent on companies like UN Habitat?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I've been working with a few countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and obviously it's a huge continent, and each country is very different, and each city is also within a country is very different. So there's not a standardized answer for that. But from a few examples that I have seen, usually there's a huge gap between central government, often the capital city, and then the secondary cities. So what has been happening lately is that many people have been going to the capital for to look for a job, or to go live with the family that has already migrated there. And so there's a lot of importance put on capital cities. But now what we are seeing is that the secondary cities are actually the ones that are going to be urbanizing the most until in the next decade. So that's where the focus should be. And what I've seen in secondary cities, which I have worked most with, is that the resources that are available to the municipalities are often a mix of own revenue streams, which could be local taxes, and sometimes small development projects that municipalities have with partners directly. And then the rest of the budget, or half of the budget, let's say, would come from a central government. But this said, sometimes it's not entirely the flow, let's say, of responsibilities is not entirely matching the flow of money that is coming to the city. So it's hard. It's partially national. It's partially financial and technical partners. It really depends. Yeah. But of course, the UN is very present in many of those secondary cities to support the development.
Okay, on from a financial aspect, but a lot as well from the strategic aspect and getting things done. I guess it's also important that the local communities have to put in some resources, because then they feel like they own it more and they feel more responsible of really taking care of it, instead of just getting a project and not knowing really what it means.
Yes, and this starts sometimes at a very small scale. I'm not an expert in that field, and I know that there's a lot of work being done on that. But from what I've seen in urban resilience, sometimes it's enough to have very small taxes for public services. Let's say if we have solid waste management, then sometimes this could be organized in a community where a part of the community is in charge of collecting the waste and maybe transforming the waste for a very small fee that the people will be paying. Sometimes it's at the municipal level, and there it would be to try to in-store and make sure that it's being collected, to have a small tax on solid waste management systems in the municipality, which does not represent a big part for each family, but if we put that all together, can contribute to quite a sum for the municipality to be able to work with that. And it's funny because sometimes people are willing to pay quite a sum. Let's say people are willing to pay €1 to get the waste collected by informal associations that bring the solid waste outside of town and burn it. This is just one example, but then they prefer to do that once a week than to be paying €1 once per month to the municipality for an organized system. So it's something that is coming. It's not there yet everywhere, but it really doesn't need much, let's say, for the municipality to become more autonomous and to be able to solve public service problems like that.
That's interesting. So let's talk about nature-based approaches to resilience. You've also told me you've worked on projects that use nature, like reforestation, to help prevent flooding and erosion. How do nature-based solutions like reforestation and mangrove restoration work in practice? Like, what makes these methods effective, and what have you learned from using those methods?
Nature-based solutions. There are many types of nature-based solutions. So you named two of them, which are both very, very interesting. They work, first of all, because we work with something that is already there. We work with the nature that is around us. So it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. It's not like we have to come with highly engineered, innovative, gray infrastructure solutions. And nature-based solutions are mostly also solutions that are already partially in the habits of local populations. It works so well also because, I guess that what we learned in engineering often comes from nature. So why not just use nature if nature itself has built its ecosystems to work and has its own mechanisms to solve problems and is relying on itself, right, to be able to survive and to develop itself. So I think nature-based solutions are incredibly interesting. Yes, we've done, for example, mangrove restoration in Madagascar under this project that I was telling you about before. And it's interesting because mangroves are the superstars under the nature-based solutions, because not only do they do flood protection, because they act as natural barriers when sea levels are rising, but also next to rivers. They are also highly effective at capturing and at storing CO2, which helps to mitigate climate change. They support super rich ecosystems, which sustain fish, and so also ecosystems like fisheries and cultural activities of local populations. And mangroves also, they filter pollutants from urban waters, which are being evacuated before they reach the ocean. So, I mean, as you can see, nature-based solutions have a lot of different types of impact. So that's why they work also so well. It's having one key entry point for many different impacts. And what I have to say from the mangrove restoration project in Madagascar, there it was very nice to see how first a group of people here in Morondava in Madagascar, it was young people who were trained to do the mangrove restoration, and see this spirit of working together, the awareness that was raised around why are mangroves important, why do they need to be restored, why is it important not to chop them off again. It was accompanied by a full day of a small festival in the city around this. So this would be. I think mangroves are one of my favorite examples of nature-based solutions, and it's highly effective, and that's been proven over and over.
Why do we not build more mangroves?
Why don't we build mangroves everywhere? I mean, that would be fantastic if we could do that. But mangroves, as far as I know, need a specific geographical locations they're in. They're mostly in coastal zones. They're mostly between the sweet water and the salty water, when not even fully in the salty water. So mangroves are meant to be in certain places, but there where we have, I mean, those are also coastal areas next to urban areas, or even far away from urban areas, are definitely places where the risk is pretty high. So that's definitely a good solution for those kind of places.
I'm also thinking, because there's so many cities that are right at the waterfront, like Panama City here, or Barcelona, Cape Town, a lot of cities that have like this hard edge, which I guess is, from a resilience perspective, not at all the best solution. What should we do there to protect the cities?
I mean, of course, cities have been building on coastal zones because it makes sense from if we look at how to nourish ourselves. Of course, it's good to be close to the water, to have the fish. Very, very basic. If we need transport, overseas transport, that's why cities were settling down next to the water. But nowadays, of course, we see it. I mean, not even nowadays, but it's exacerbated now with the climate change. Coastal cities are amongst the most vulnerable ones. And that's partially, as you say, because there has been a lot of urbanization, which has made that the ground is permeable now, and that water cannot trickle in down as well anymore. I mean, hard edges can be a solution. Building dikes and building seawalls is one part of the solution. What can help in those kind of cities is to make sure that, I mean, when we have a coastal city, we often also have not very far away a hill or a mountain on the other side, right? So just make sure that the water that is streaming down from the mountains, which will be more and more if we have a lot of rainfall, that one is able to come down to the sea in an adapted manner. So I think drainage systems are extremely important in coastal cities, because not only do we have the water coming from above, we also have then the sea level that is rising, and that combination then makes the city extremely vulnerable. So it's about, I think it depends, of course, on the city, but I mean, hard edges are not specifically, not always bad. One of the solutions also would be to have more regulations, so to see where are the high risk prone zones, and where should we be building, where should we not be building in future.
If you're enjoying the show, I have a small favor to ask that would mean the world to me. By rating and sharing the podcast, you're helping us grow and spreading our mission of making sustainability really desirable and cool to a wider audience. Besides of that, imagine impressing your colleagues with the latest insights on sustainable architecture. So make sure you follow the podcast and become the most informed in the room. Thank you so much for your support. Let's talk about Valencia, where recent flooding has caused huge damages. Based on your experience, what lessons do you think cities can take from this? And what could have been done differently to prepare?
Exactly. Valencia is showing how the effects of climate change are not only overseas from an European perspective, but are also affecting Europe. It's not only been in Spain. We have had very, very big floods in Germany, in Austria, and in other countries over the last years. I think in Valencia, with the knowledge that I have so far, one of the problems was really an urban expansion in low-lying zones. So that is exactly what I was talking about, right? People were settling down next to a river where it was known that the risk of flooding was quite high. There's also, of course, by urbanizing and by building hard infrastructure on the ground over the years, there's this human impact on the ground and on the natural waterways. And one thing I have understood also is that the drainage systems, as we have been saying in Valencia, also were outdated. So all of this, of course, made residents increasingly vulnerable to flooding. And on top of that, something else that happened during the Valencia floods was that their early warning system wasn't as efficient as it could have been. So it seems that residents have been not being provided timely alerts for the fast-moving storms that were coming in, and that made it way harder for people to evacuate or prepare in time. So I think here the best that we can do, and there's always like a cycle of once a disaster happens, there's the recovery time where we, of course, want to recover as fast as possible, be there for the people that are in need, make sure that everyone has a home, has enough food, has water that is clean, because waterborne disease is one of the biggest problems that we have with floods. And then from there on to a long-term reconstruction of those sites. But doing that, we always say, building back better, right? So we're not going to build exactly what we had on the same place, because obviously this is dangerous. Exactly. But then building back better, analyzing what has happened. What were the problems? Was there missing coordination between the departments, for example, meteorological and infrastructure and the service for civil society? And from there, then really plan ahead with a very exact analysis and a very risk-informed analysis of what has happened, to ensure that if we rebuild the city, we make it in a sustainable way, in a safer way, and then we can also build in a greener manner and make sure that doesn't happen again.
You've worked on resilience projects across Africa, and now you're going to start focusing on Europe. What are the biggest differences or similarities that you see between these regions? And are there any lessons that you can take from Africa, or that Africa's approach that Europe could benefit from Africa's approach?
So I think one thing that I'm definitely taking with me is that it's the way these things should be planned, and the way the solutions should be looked at is always in the same way. What I've really learned is that no city can make decisions without having consulted either scientists, the population that is living there, or the private sector. I mean, all of the stakeholders that are part of the urban sphere are important to make sure that the solutions are really adapted to the local context, and also that they're effective once they are being implemented. So I think that's something that I'm taking with me. And I think it's exactly the same thing in Europe. I mean, I already see some projects that are very participatory. Having lived in Switzerland for a long while, I've seen that there is urban planning that is done in a participatory way. There are even apps where you could, from a certain municipality, where you could say, look, I think this and this could be a solution, right? But also having sessions where people plan together. And I think that's crucial. And I think if we want to make it work, and if we want people to be involved and interested and take action on climate, for example, and on building green outside of just even if it's outside of their everyday jobs, I think that's what we need to do. I mean, urban life I still think it's concerning everyone, so everyone should be or should be able to be involved.
Tell me more about your new job. So you're moving into cultural heritage work. Even though this is a completely new area for you, what connections do you already see between your work you've done in resilience and climate adaptation and your new role in cultural heritage?
They might not be exactly the same niche, but it all goes into sustainable development. And it all goes, for me, it all goes under the umbrella of resilience. I mean, resilience, I've been talking a lot about climate resilience, but resilience in general for a city, it can be being resilient to climate change impact. It can be resilient to economic shocks. It can be resilient to conflicts or to other social issues like violence and a lot of robberies or theft or things like that. So really resilience actually comes as a holistic approach. It's really a full package. And also you cannot have climate resilience if you don't have the other aspects. A city that is not working on the social cohesion or that is in conflict is always, I mean, to have solutions that work for climate adaptation need to go together with the other ones. And so sustainable development is, for me, and resilience is that. In this new job in cultural heritage, in the protection of cultural heritage in conflict zones, we are actually also talking about resilience and about sustainable development, because for sustainable development of a city, of a community, of a group of people, making sure that culture is being preserved and that they're able to have access to culture, to exercise their habits is crucial, because it's part of the belief, it's part of the faith, it's part of the hope of a society, of a working, of a functioning society. So therefore, it's also part of resilience. And I mean, it's often the case that during conflict, for example, cultural heritage is being specifically targeted because that's where it hurts. That's what people identify with. So for me, that's also part of a resilient city, or making sure that communities are resilient, and also making sure that it's able to develop in a sustainable manner.
And your work again or still focuses on before a disaster happens, right? And not what do we do after something happens?
So it will be both. It can be in as a measure of prevention, but there are also emergency measures that are being taken once the conflict has started. So it could be making sure that in a conflict zone where it's known to have a lot of problems with looting of artifacts. So there we could make sure that they are being protected before the disaster happens, may it be conflict or may it be from a climatic disasters. But it's also about ensuring that we have a strategy, an emergency strategy, once the conflict has broken out or the disaster has happened.
So I want to go back to Africa, to Cameroon. And this is a topic I often speak about in any context because I think it applies to all of us. And it's the main driver from my point of view towards a more sustainable future. So in Cameroon, you told me that you've seen kind of a big preference for concrete over brick, even though brick is more sustainable, but concrete was seen as more modern and cooler in a way. How do you think we can shift that perception and make sustainable choices feel more desirable?
Yes, that was a tough one. Absolutely. When I was in Cameroon, so just maybe for the audience, I was asked to construct a primary school, which in a remote village, really 3.5 hours from Yaoundé, from the capital. And I designed. I was looking at the context, and I designed a school made out of locally produced bricks that is really trying to fit the landscape around it. And as you have said right now, I encountered some opposition from the people living there. I mean, it was the association of parents from the scholars who needed a new school, who actually in the beginning had asked for the school. And then afterwards they said, but this looks like in the village. We don't want something that looks like in the village. We want something, I mean, we have you coming from the capital, then we also want something that looks, as you said, more modern and cooler. And we want this building out of concrete with huge windows in it, in a place where it's 30 with 35 degrees most of the year with a lot of sunshine. And that's where I also understood that who am I to come here and say what this should look like, right? So that's actually the very beginning, before working at UN Habitat, where I saw that participatory approaches are extremely important. There is this amazing book called The Concrete City, Material Flows and Urbanization in West Africa, from a professor. She's called Armelle Choplin. She's a professor in urban studies specializing in African urbanization. And she examines the central role of concrete in shaping urban landscapes in Western Africa. And as in the beginning, so during the colonial era, concrete was a luxurious material that only a few people could afford. And that over time then became an essential material that is available to almost everyone. It's very low cost and affordable, right? So it is now related to the rapid urbanization that we are experiencing, but it's also in the village. It's related to a certain urban coolness and a certain status. And that was for me, it was fascinating, because I told the company I was working with, well, but brick is more environmentally friendly. Why should they be building sustainably if they have not contributed to it, right? So that's really a conflict that is difficult to resolve. And in the end, the way in which it worked was that we started discussing about how long the material would be, how long the material lives, how does it become older, how does it change over the years, and especially what is the best for the children that are inside in terms of
the conditions, right?
Yeah, exactly. What are the best conditions.
Thermal and
in terms of temperature, in terms of air quality and all of that. And at some point, then people agreed to have the school being built in brick, but then in a slightly different design. So that's the compromise that we were able to do, that it was not looking like like a traditional house, but that it had a bit of shapes that were that were very geometric and playing with each other. And that's how at the end we were able to construct it in brick.
That's actually a really cool lesson to understand what people want. They want a modern design, but we can get a modern design without a worse sustainable footprint. I actually had a similar conversation with a podcast guest. His name is Charles, and he's from France, but they build sustainable architecture projects in Vietnam. And he also said his clients are mostly Europeans who want like you said, that cute bamboo house in Vietnam somewhere. But the local people mainly want concrete and glass. And so what they do when they work with local people, he also said, timber is not really sustainable there because there are massive deforestations. So they do use concrete, but they focus on creating really good climates and natural ventilation so that at least they don't need air conditioning. They integrate a lot of plants. So at least they kind of make the most out of the concrete usage.
No, absolutely. And then it's also another point to all of this where I also understand is that concrete is just cheaper. Concrete has become so cheap over the years. And then now building in brick, if it's not, for example, the brick or the bamboo, I mean, I guess it must be the same if it's not done really by hand, next to the house I want to build on the floor, and we want to do it in a slightly more industrialized process. That costs a lot of money because the demand is just lower. So now in Cameroon, for example, I know that the ministry is working, and I've been visiting them. They're working on a laboratory for materials, for local materials. But from there to becoming really, to really win the competition against the concrete that we can have everywhere, and that is very low cost, and that is affordable, and that is also some kind of a savings account now for many people, because I mean, people don't have money in the bank, but they have, as soon as they get money, they buy the concrete and put it on the side, and then someday they'll be building, and they build step by step. That's really, it's alternative to our modern savings account. And as soon as this economic factor is not changing, I don't know how it was in Vietnam. I think it's very difficult to change minds, but it's there. There are more and more, what I've seen in some countries in Africa. Right. Recently, I just saw a very interesting and amazing Senegalese architect. Is that we have more and more architects also trying to work with local materials, and not only with the cool globalized materials that we want to implement here. So the conscious the conscious is there, and I hope and think there will be more and more projects that will be sustainable also in those countries that will be built. And it's important because, as I said, it's one of the Africa is one of the continents that is the continent that is urbanizing in the most rapid manner.
Laia, I have one last question for you. Can you showcase one sustainable project or structure from around the world that you really like?
One project that I really like is the Green Wall Initiative. The Green Wall Initiative, it's basically an 8,000 kilometer belt across the Sahel, which goes from Senegal to Djibouti, which is supposed to be planted with trees, gardens, and green measures. So this initiative was launched in 2007, and it's aiming to slow desertification. So here we are out of cities, we are out of the maybe of the conventional architecture, but we are literally in the building green. And I'm very impressed by that. And although the initiative is unfortunately far from being completed, I like the utopian idea of saying, okay, how can you turn one of the most arid places in this world greener? You know, how can you minimize the effects in terms of desertification and maybe help at the same time to solve problems in nutrition, self-sufficiency of those populations? And why should this green wall not go through a city? I mean, why should a city not be part of it? And I mean, we do also know some cities that have them inside the city. And inside this green wall, and I think what is really interesting is experimenting, really seeing what can we do, how far can we go, what is possible in innovation only with innovative green solutions and with nature-based solutions. And one of the attempts at greening these very dry places with high water scarcity and where it's more and more difficult to make plants grow is the circular gardens. So circular gardens are typically they're being used in Senegal, for example. There are gardens where different types of plants are organized in circles around the central place, which sometimes can contain a water source or sometimes a compost pit. And they're arranged based on their water and nutrient needs. So sometimes one plant can benefit from the other. It's basically what we call permaculture, and this maximizes space and minimizes water consumption. And I don't understand enough of it. I would eager to learn more about it. So I don't know if maybe that could be some of your future guests on this podcast. But I think it's a really interesting. I think we should be doing Ethiopian projects. I think we should be trying out stuff. And it could be in the city, it could be outside of the city to make sure that the city can also benefit from it. And so that's something I'm really eager to see the results in a few years.
That's definitely very interesting. I'm going to look into it and see if I find the next podcast guest in that area. Thank you so much, Laia, for joining me. It has been very interesting talking to you. I've learned so many things and I'm super excited to see where your journey takes you.
Thank you, Ladina. It was a pleasure to be here.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at @LadinaShipf. Thanks.